In the early 14th century, Europe did not appear to be on the verge of cultural renewal. It was a continent shaped by feudal loyalties, powerful religious authority, and a worldview that placed heaven above earthly concerns. Most people lived in small, rural communities. Their days were measured by church bells, seasonal labor, and the expectations of their local lord. Education was limited, books were rare, and knowledge traveled slowly through handwritten manuscripts kept in monasteries and cathedral schools. The intellectual center of high medieval Europe had been theology. Scholars debated divine grace, the relationship between faith and reason, and the structure of Christian doctrine. Universities had emerged in cities such as Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, but their studies focused mainly on law, medicine, and religious philosophy. The ancient worlds of Greece and Rome were known, yet their writings were often filtered through medieval commentary. Classical authors were studied less for their insights into human experience than for the ways they could support Christian teaching. Beneath this apparent stability, however, subtle changes were taking place. Trade routes expanded across the Mediterranean, and Italian city-states such as Florence, Venice, and Genoa prospered through commerce. Banking families accumulated wealth not from land alone, but from financial networks that stretched across Europe and toward Constantinople. Urban life became more complex. A merchant class emerged that was ambitious, educated, and increasingly independent of traditional feudal structures. Then, in 1347, ships arrived in the ports of southern Europe carrying a disease that would devastate the continent. The Black Death spread rapidly and, within a few years, killed perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population. Entire villages were abandoned. Priests, physicians, artisans, and laborers fell ill. The familiar rhythms of life were shattered. The plague did not directly cause the Renaissance, but it altered the balance of society. With so many people dead, labor became scarce. Survivors found new economic opportunities, and wages rose in some regions. Serfs negotiated better conditions or moved to towns in search of work. The rigid hierarchies of the medieval world loosened slightly, while authorities that had once seemed unquestionable began to face quiet doubt. The church remained powerful, but it struggled to provide clear answers to the suffering. The Great Schism of 1378 weakened its unity further, as rival popes claimed legitimacy from Rome and Avignon. For ordinary people, the certainty that had defined earlier generations seemed less secure. Some responded with renewed devotion, others turned toward new forms of inquiry. Political life in the Italian peninsula differed from that of much of northern Europe. Instead of large, unified kingdoms, Italy consisted of independent city-states, urban republics, and duchies competing for influence. Florence, Milan, Venice, and Rome developed distinct identities. Their wealth came from trade, textile production, and finance. Their leaders included merchants, bankers, and nobles whose status depended not only on inheritance, but also on skill, calculation, and political judgment. Florence, in particular, became a place where civic pride and competition encouraged innovation. Its citizens valued public display, grand buildings, impressive artworks, and visible signs of prosperity. Guilds regulated commerce and sponsored construction projects, while political power shifted among influential families. Although government remained restricted, participation in civic life was broader than it was in many European monarchies. Within this environment, a new intellectual mood began to take shape. Some scholars started reading ancient Roman texts not merely as authorities on doctrine, but as voices speaking across the centuries. They admired the clarity of Cicero's Latin, the moral reflections of Seneca, and the historical narratives of Livy. These works seemed grounded in human experience rather than solely in theology. One figure closely associated with this shift was Francesco Petrarch. Born in 1304, Petrarch devoted himself to collecting and studying classical manuscripts. He wrote letters addressed to ancient authors as though they were living companions. To him, the past was not a distant shadow, but a conversation partner. He believed that the moral and literary achievements of Rome could inspire renewal in his own time. This approach gradually formed the foundation of humanism. Humanists did not reject religion, and most remained devout Christians. They placed greater emphasis, however, on human agency, classical education, and the study of language, history, and ethics. They believed that by understanding the achievements of antiquity, individuals could cultivate virtue and contribute responsibly to civic life. As scholars re-examined ancient texts, artists began reconsidering how they represented the visible world. Medieval art had often emphasized symbolic meaning. Figures appeared stylized, flat, and arranged according to spiritual importance rather than physical scale. Gold backgrounds suggested heavenly space instead of earthly depth. Painters now experimented with perspective, shading, and proportion. They observed how light fell across surfaces and how bodies occupied space. This transformation did not occur suddenly. It unfolded gradually as artists learned from one another and studied the remains of classical sculpture. Across the Italian landscape, Roman ruins offered broken columns, arches, and statues that hinted at a civilization devoted to symmetry and balance. Architects measured these remains carefully, seeking the mathematical harmony they believed had governed ancient design. Economic forces supported these developments. Wealthy families commissioned paintings and buildings not only for churches, but also for private homes and civic spaces. Art became a way to express status and devotion at the same time. Competition among patrons encouraged higher standards and bolder experimentation. Trade carried more than goods. It also transmitted ideas from the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Greek scholars migrated westward, bringing manuscripts and knowledge of the Greek language. Their arrival enriched the study of ancient Greek texts in Italy. Plato, who had been overshadowed by Aristotle in much medieval scholastic thought, found new readers. The Renaissance emerged from practical concerns as much as from inspiration. City-states needed skilled administrators. Courts required diplomats who could compose persuasive letters in refined Latin. Merchants depended on mathematics and accounting. Education adapted to these needs by emphasizing rhetoric, grammar, history, and classical models. By the 15th century, Italian writers began using words associated with rinascita, or rebirth, to describe what they believed was happening. They saw themselves as recovering a culture that had been neglected. Yet they did not simply copy the ancient world. They reshaped it, adapting classical forms, ideals, and imagery to Christian themes and the changing needs of their own society. Ancient myths appeared alongside biblical narratives in frescoes and sculptures, revealing how Renaissance artists could draw from two traditions at once. Beyond Italy, however, cultural change moved more slowly. Northern Europe retained stronger feudal traditions and developed artistic styles of its own. Flemish painters became renowned for their detailed oil techniques, while scholars in France, Germany, and England corresponded with Italian humanists. Trade networks connected these regions, allowing books, paintings, ideas, and artistic methods to travel across political boundaries. The Renaissance was not a single event, but a long process stretching from the 14th to the 17th century. It unfolded unevenly. Some cities flourished while others declined, and wars between Italian states repeatedly disrupted stability. Later invasions by foreign powers produced further uncertainty. Yet conflict could also spread activist and intellectual ideas. Displaced artists carried their skills to new courts and cities, where local patrons introduced them to fresh audiences. The political landscape changed as well. Powerful families such as the Medici in Florence used patronage strategically. By funding libraries, churches, and academies, they reinforced civic identity while displaying their own authority. Cultural investment became a form of political influence. A palace, chapel, or public sculpture could honor the city, strengthen a family's reputation, and communicate ideals of order and magnificence. Patronage, therefore, shaped not only what artists produced, but also how communities understood power. For most people, however, life remained rooted in farming and skilled labor. The Renaissance did not immediately transform ordinary routines. Urban centers offered new possibilities, though. Apprentices trained in workshops, students attended universities, and literacy slowly increased among the middle classes. As the 15th century progressed, confidence grew in certain educated circles. Artists signed their works more frequently, asserting individual authorship. Architects designed buildings inspired by Roman temples but adapted them to contemporary needs. Scholars edited and printed texts with increasing accuracy. The medieval world had emphasized continuity and inherited tradition. The emerging Renaissance spirit introduced a measured curiosity about change. It asked whether ancient wisdom could illuminate present problems and valued observation and experience alongside established authority. By the early 16th century, Europe looked visibly different from the world of 13 centuries earlier. Cities had expanded, courts displayed refined culture, and education had broadened beyond strictly clerical training. A growing number of people believed that human effort could shape destiny within the boundaries of faith. This confidence would soon face new challenges, including religious division, scientific controversy, and global expansion. At its beginning, however, the Renaissance was a quiet turning of attention from heaven alone to the world below, and from tradition alone to inquiry. In that turning, a steady and enduring culture began to form. Europe looked back to Rome and Athens while moving, often without fully realizing it, toward modernity. Florence's intellectual circles and artistic workshops represented only a small portion of its population. Most people experienced the Renaissance not as a philosophical movement, but as a gradual change in the texture of daily life. Streets became busy from early morning. Bakers opened their shutters before sunrise, and the smell of fresh bread mingled with smoke from household hearths. Merchants arranged goods beneath wooden awnings, while apprentices swept thresholds and prepared tools. Food varied according to wealth and region. In Italian cities, bread formed the foundation of most meals. Prosperous households generally used wheat, while poorer families relied on darker grains, such as barley or rye. Olive oil replaced butter across much of the peninsula. Beans, onions, cabbage, and lentils were common, and seasonal vegetables shaped the rhythm of cooking. Markets reflected what the surrounding countryside could supply at a given moment. Meat was less frequent for ordinary families. When available, it was often pork or salted fish. Wealthier households consumed beef, game, and imported spices. Sugar, once extremely rare, became more accessible through Mediterranean trade. Banquets in elite homes displayed abundance through roasted meats, sweet pastries, and fruit preserves, while servants and laborers ate much more modestly. Wine accompanied nearly every meal, often diluted with water. Because clean drinking water was not always reliable in crowded cities, wine served both social and practical purposes. In taverns, citizens gathered after work to exchange news. Merchants discussed trade, artisans debated guild matters, and travelers shared stories from distant regions. Clothing signaled social position just as clearly. Sumptuary laws regulated which fabrics and colors different classes could wear. Silk, velvet, and bright dyes indicated wealth, while wool dominated the wardrobes of artisans and laborers. Tailors adjusted garments to changing fashions. In Florence, long gowns with fitted sleeves and carefully shaped doublets became popular among prosperous residents. Homes revealed similar distinctions. Wealthy families lived in stone palaces built around central courtyards, with painted walls, carved furniture, and decorative textiles. Most urban dwellers occupied smaller apartments above shops or within crowded neighborhoods. Wooden beams supported upper floors, and rooms served several purposes at once: sleeping, cooking, storage, and work. Candles and oil lamps provided light. After sunset, streets grew quieter, and nighttime travel required caution. Watchmen patrolled districts, while city gates were sometimes closed at particular hours. Education expanded gradually. Sons of merchants often attended grammar schools, where they studied Latin texts and arithmetic. Girls received less formal instruction, although wealthy families sometimes ensured that their daughters learned to read and write. Convents offered additional opportunities for female literacy. Marriage functioned as both a personal and economic arrangement. Families negotiated contracts carefully, and dowries influenced alliances between households. Weddings were public occasions marked by feasting and display. Once married, women managed domestic affairs, oversaw servants when available, and contributed to family businesses. In artisan households, wives frequently participated in production and sales. Childhood was often shaped by apprenticeship. Boys as young as 12 entered workshops to learn painting, metalworking, weaving, banking, or other trades. Masters provided instruction in exchange for labor, and agreements could last several years. The workshop became both workplace and school, transmitting technical skills and professional habits. Religious life remained central. Church attendance structured the week, while feast days filled the calendar with processions, music, and communal gatherings. Saints' days offered moments of celebration amid routine labor. Even humanists who admired classical literature maintained devotional practices. Public squares served as stages for civic identity, where religious ceremonies, markets, announcements, and festivals brought the varied communities of Renaissance cities together. During Carnival, masks, costumes, and performances transformed familiar streets into spaces of playful disorder. Theater and traveling entertainers offered stories drawn from biblical narratives, popular legends, and classical myths. Music accompanied domestic, religious, and courtly life. Lutes, recorders, and early keyboard instruments sounded in private homes and noble residences, while sacred choral music filled churches and cathedrals. Composers experimented with harmony and polyphony, creating layered musical textures that expressed the period's fascination with order, balance, and proportion. Standards of hygiene varied considerably. Public bathhouses operated in some cities, although fears that bathing might encourage disease caused their popularity to rise and fall. People washed privately when water, fuel, and suitable space were available. Families relied on herbal preparations and practical household knowledge to treat minor injuries and illnesses. University-trained physicians attended prosperous patients, generally following medical theories inherited from Greek, Roman, Arabic, and medieval authorities. Merchants, officials, scholars, and diplomats traveled with increasing frequency. Roads linked major urban centers, but journeys remained slow, expensive, and uncomfortable. Inns provided food and lodging of uneven quality. Letters carried commercial information, political reports, and personal news between regions. Expanding courier networks gradually made communication faster and more dependable, strengthening connections among courts, banks, and trading communities. Books were still costly possessions, but printing began to alter their availability after the middle of the 15th century. Workshops produced growing numbers of pamphlets, instructional works, devotional books, and classical texts. Urban literacy increased gradually, though reading did not always occur in solitude. One literate person might read aloud to an entire household or workshop. Rural life continued to follow the agricultural calendar. Planting, tending, and harvesting determined the pace and intensity of work, and villages preserved older customs longer than rapidly changing cities. Nevertheless, nearby market towns connected peasants with wider economic developments. Demand for grain and wool affected what landowners and farmers chose to produce. Work did not exclude recreation. People enjoyed storytelling, board games, seasonal fairs, ball games, and public contests. Hunting remained especially associated with noble status. Celebrations commemorated political victories, dynastic occasions, and sacred observances. European diets also began a gradual transformation as overseas exploration brought unfamiliar products into circulation. Spices became more affordable for some consumers, while foods such as tomatoes and maize reached Europe. Their widespread acceptance, however, took generations. Although society remained strongly hierarchical, limited advancement was possible. Successful merchants could use wealth, marriage, education, and patronage to improve their family's standing. Schooling opened paths into government service or the church. Differences in rank nevertheless remained visible in clothing, housing, manners, and legal privileges. Guilds regulated much of urban professional life. They supervised apprenticeships, maintained standards, influenced prices, and protected members' interests. Membership also supplied companionship and a sense of collective identity. During civic processions, guilds displayed banners and emblems that proclaimed their importance to the community. Disease remained a persistent threat. Plague returned periodically, though later outbreaks were generally less catastrophic than the great epidemics of the 14th century. Households stored remedies and sought spiritual protection through prayers, relics, and charitable acts. High mortality shaped attitudes toward marriage, children, religion, and the future. Municipal governments responded unevenly by paving streets, improving drainage, regulating waste, and constructing fountains that supplied public water. Investment in public buildings and infrastructure became another expression of civic pride. Courtly life beyond Florence followed its own rhythms of diplomacy, hunting, entertainment, and carefully staged ceremony. Baldassare Castiglione's Book of the Courtier presented the ideal aristocrat as graceful, educated, musically accomplished, physically skilled, and capable of sophisticated conversation. These ideals influenced elite conduct even when daily reality fell short of them. Environmental conditions also affected ordinary experience. Cooler weather associated with the Little Ice Age became increasingly apparent during the later 16th century. Failed harvests drove up food prices and placed severe pressure on poor families. Yet life cannot be understood through hardship alone. Shared meals, family gatherings, neighborhood ties, and religious celebrations created continuity. Skilled artisans produced textiles, metalwork, furniture, ceramics, and paintings that traveled through regional and international markets. By the 17th century, changes associated with the Renaissance had made many European cities more literate, commercially interconnected, and culturally ambitious. Most inhabitants did not imagine themselves participating in a dramatic rebirth. They encountered change through new books, fashions, foods, occupations, and possibilities. The period took shape in herb-scented kitchens, crowded shops, noisy workshops, and transactions conducted across market stalls. Its effects entered routines quietly, altering European society through countless ordinary decisions. Florence's 15th century prosperity depended not only on its merchants and guilds, but also on families able to convert wealth into lasting influence. None did so more effectively than the Medici. Their rise began not with noble titles or conquest, but with banking, calculated loans, discreet negotiations, and branches operating across Europe. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici established the family's financial foundation during the early 15th century. Managing papal accounts brought his bank substantial profits and prestige. Yet, Giovanni avoided presenting himself as an arrogant ruler. He supported charities and public construction, cultivating an image of civic responsibility. Such generosity made the Medici appear to be Florence's benefactors rather than its masters. His son Cosimo inherited both the fortune and the political method. Florence officially remained a republic whose offices rotated among eligible citizens, so an open seizure of power risked provoking fierce opposition. Cosimo instead worked through friendships, alliances, banking relationships, and patronage. He financed churches, monasteries, libraries, and humanist scholars, turning material generosity into loyalty and informal authority. Rivals forced Cosimo into exile in 1433 after accusing him of accumulating excessive power. Within a year, however, his supporters arranged his return. Thereafter, he exercised influence cautiously, seldom occupying prominent offices while directing policy behind the scenes. He also helped make Florence a center of artistic innovation. At the convent of San Marco, his financing enabled extensive reconstruction and supported Fra Angelico's frescoes, works that united devotional intensity with the Renaissance interest in perspective, proportion, and convincing human presence. By the early 15th century, painting in Italy began to look different from what earlier generations had known. Medieval artists had conveyed sacred stories with clarity and devotion. Yet their figures often seemed suspended in patterned space, defined more by symbolism than by physical presence. Renaissance painters increasingly sought to make holy events appear credible within a recognizable world. They studied anatomy, light, architecture, and the effects of distance. Their figures occupied spaces that seemed measurable, and their gestures communicated emotion as well as theological meaning. This transformation did not mean that religious belief had disappeared. Christianity remained central to artistic production, and churches continued to commission altarpieces, frescoes, sculptures, and illuminated manuscripts. Yet they did not simply copy the ancient world. They reshaped it, adapting classical forms, ideals, and imagery to Christian themes and the changing concerns of their own society. The calm dignity of a Roman figure could be used to represent a saint. A carefully proportioned building could become a setting for a biblical event. Classical architectural details, including columns, arches, and pediments, gave sacred spaces an appearance of order and permanence. The revival of antiquity was therefore selective. Artists and patrons admired the surviving remains of Greece and Rome, but they interpreted those remains through contemporary religious and civic values. Human figures became more substantial, individualized, and expressive, while the surrounding environment acquired greater importance. Perspective helped organize the image and guide the viewer's attention. It also suggested that the visible world could be understood through observation and reason. This confidence reflected the wider intellectual movement known as humanism. Humanism placed renewed emphasis on the study of language, history, moral philosophy, and rhetoric. Scholars examined ancient authors not merely to recover old knowledge, but to use it in addressing present problems. They asked how citizens should behave, how rulers ought to govern, and how education could improve both individuals and communities. Even humanists who admired classical literature maintained devotional practices. Many attended Mass, supported monasteries, commissioned religious art, and understood ancient wisdom as compatible with Christian truth. The apparent opposition between humanism and religion was often overstated. In practice, the two frequently developed together. Education also became an important marker of social distinction. Wealthy families hired tutors, collected books, and cultivated familiarity with classical texts. The ability to speak and write elegant Latin could open doors to government service, diplomacy, and ecclesiastical office. At the same time, vernacular literature expanded the audience for poetry and historical writing. Authors increasingly used Italian to address readers beyond the narrow circle of university-trained scholars. This linguistic development strengthened regional identities while contributing to a broader cultural exchange across the peninsula. Civic life provided another setting in which Renaissance ideals became visible. Public squares served as stages for civic identity, where religious ceremonies, markets, and political announcements brought different social groups together. Statues and fountains commemorated military victories, honored local saints, or represented the virtues that communities wished to claim. Government buildings displayed paintings of legendary founders, just rulers, and scenes of communal sacrifice. Such images were not neutral decoration. They taught viewers how the city understood its past, and how citizens were expected to serve the common good. Florence became especially famous for combining commercial energy with cultural ambition. Its wealth came from banking, textiles, trade, and skilled craftsmanship. Merchant families competed for influence by financing churches, chapels, hospitals, libraries, and public improvements. Their generosity could express genuine piety, but it also created lasting visibility. A family name attached to a chapel or an altarpiece entered the city's collective memory. Patronage thus worked as both philanthropy and political communication. The Medici understood this connection with unusual effectiveness. Their support extended beyond individual commissions to entire networks of artists, scholars, architects, and religious institutions. By providing steady financial assistance, they allowed ambitious projects to continue over many years. Artists benefited from access to materials, workshops, and influential clients, while patrons gained prestige through association with exceptional works. The relationship was not always harmonious. Patrons could demand revisions, control subject matter, or intervene in decisions that artists considered their own. Nevertheless, negotiation between economic power and artistic skill produced new possibilities. Architecture offered a particularly visible expression of these ambitions. Churches and palaces were designed to appear orderly, balanced, and durable. Geometric proportions suggested that human intelligence could bring harmony to the built environment. The careful arrangement of columns, courtyards, windows, and domes connected contemporary buildings with the authority of antiquity while meeting practical needs. Palaces had to accommodate business, family life, ceremonies, and political meetings. Churches had to serve worshippers while also presenting an image of institutional strength. The same principles shaped sculpture. Artists examined ancient statues and developed a stronger interest in weight, movement, musculature, and individualized expression. A figure could stand firmly on the ground, turn its head, or communicate tension through a carefully observed pose. These innovations made sculpture seem less like a symbolic sign and more like a living presence. Yet the meaning of the work still depended on its setting. A statue in a cathedral, palace, or public square addressed different audiences and carried different political implications. Florence's cultural prominence also depended on its ability to attract talent. Artists traveled between cities, carrying techniques, designs, and ideas with them. Apprentices learned in workshops where painting, sculpture, goldsmithing, and architecture overlapped. A painter might study engineering, while an architect might understand sculpture and military construction. This practical exchange encouraged experimentation and helped dissolve rigid boundaries between artistic disciplines. He also helped make Florence a center of artistic innovation. At the convent of San Marco, his financing enabled extensive reconstruction and supported Fra Angelico's frescoes, works that united devotional intensity with the Renaissance interest in perspective, proportion, and convincing human presence. Painters now turned their attention to how bodies occupied rooms, how light fell across fabric, and how architecture could frame a scene with measurable depth. One of the earliest signs of this transition appeared in the work of Giotto di Bondone in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Though he belonged to an earlier generation, his frescoes at the Arena Chapel in Padua suggested solidity and emotional restraint rather than decorative abstraction. Figures stood firmly on the ground, and drapery followed the weight of the bodies beneath it. Their gestures and expressions conveyed grief, tenderness, and uncertainty in ways that made sacred narratives feel immediate and human. Giotto's influence lingered for decades, encouraging artists to observe the physical and emotional world more carefully. In Florence during the early 1400s, Masaccio carried these developments further. Working in the Brancacci Chapel, he applied linear perspective to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface. Lines converged toward a single vanishing point, and viewers standing before his frescoes experienced a convincing depth that drew the eye inward. His figures possessed weight and proportion derived from observation. Bodies cast shadows, occupied space, and interacted with one another rather than appearing as isolated signs. Perspective itself emerged through experimentation. Filippo Brunelleschi conducted studies using mirrors and painted panels to test geometric principles, demonstrating that mathematical rules could organize visual space. Leon Battista Alberti later described these principles in his treatise on painting, providing theoretical structure for methods that artists had been developing in workshops. This new attention to space altered composition. Backgrounds shifted from symbolic goldfields to architectural emergencies and natural landscapes. Hills receded into the distance through atmospheric perspective, with colors fading into softer tones. The sky replaced patterned backdrops, and buildings were arranged according to coherent systems of proportion. The world depicted on walls and panels began to resemble the one viewers inhabited. Such realism did not displace religious meaning. Instead, it made biblical events appear present and accessible, as though sacred history unfolded within recognizable spaces before the eyes of the faithful. Sculpture underwent parallel changes. Donatello's works displayed anatomical accuracy informed by direct study. His marble figures conveyed individual character rather than generalized types, while his reliefs used shallow carving to create subtle gradations of depth known as rilievo schiacciato. This technique allowed sculptors to suggest distant spaces with minimal projection. Artists also examined surviving classical statues. Excavations in Rome uncovered fragments of ancient art, revealing balanced poses, natural proportions, and a renewed understanding of the human body. The contrapposto stance, with weight shifted onto one leg, gave figures a sense of movement combined with stability. Renaissance sculptors adapted this posture to Christian subjects, allowing saints and biblical figures to appear both spiritually significant and physically convincing. The materials and techniques of art also expanded. Oil painting, refined in Northern Europe, gradually entered Italian practice. Oil allowed richer transitions between colors and longer drying times, enabling artists to build up delicate layers and render textures in greater detail. Tempera remained common, particularly for panel painting, but experimentation continued. Workshops organized artistic training systematically. Masters oversaw apprentices who ground pigments, prepared panels, stretched surfaces, and copied drawings. Skills were transmitted through repetition and correction, while guild regulations defined standards and protected professional reputation. Commissions came from churches, confraternities, civic governments, and private patrons. Altarpieces remained central, yet their compositions evolved. Figures interacted within unified spaces rather than occupying isolated compartments, and narrative scenes unfolded with increasing spatial coherence. Religious themes retained their importance. The Virgin Mary, the saints, and episodes from the Bible dominated commissions. Yet representation emphasized humanity. Expressions suggested quiet reflection or measured sorrow rather than exaggerated gestures. Artists sought to balance devotion with realism, creating images that invited both reverence and emotional identification. As the 15th century advanced, experimentation accelerated. Andrea del Verrocchio combined sculpture and painting in his workshop, where Leonardo da Vinci trained. Verrocchio's bronze works demonstrated refined surface treatment and careful attention to anatomy. Piero della Francesca explored geometry in both painting and theoretical writing. His works displayed clarity and calm arrangement, with figures standing within architectural settings constructed through precise perspective grids. Light appeared consistent and rational, illuminating forms without confusion. Competition between artists encouraged technical advancement, while civic pride motivated cities to commission impressive works. Public monuments commemorated leaders and victories, turning art into an expression of collective identity. Portraiture gained prominence as individuals sought to record their likenesses with dignity. Portrait paintings shifted from profile views reminiscent of ancient coins to three-quarter perspectives that suggested psychological presence. Patrons requested accurate representations of facial features, clothing, and social status. Such images reflected a growing interest in individual identity, even as portraiture continued to communicate family honor, political influence, and religious virtue. Architectural design paralleled developments in painting and sculpture. Brunelleschi's dome for Florence Cathedral represented an extraordinary engineering solution to a long-standing problem. The cathedral's vast crossing required a structure spanning unprecedented width without the traditional use of massive supporting frames. Brunelleschi devised a double-shell dome using interlocking herringbone brick patterns. His achievement combined the study of Roman precedents with innovative construction methods. Buildings designed during this period emphasized symmetry and proportion. Columns, pilasters, and arches referenced classical forms, while facades displayed measured intervals rather than excessive ornament. Interior spaces aimed for harmonious geometry, allowing architecture itself to become an image of rational order. Leon Battista Alberti contributed further theoretical reflection. His treatises on painting and architecture articulated principles derived from antiquity and adapted them to contemporary practice. He described beauty as arising from mathematical relationships among parts, arguing that no element should be added or removed without disturbing the whole. His writings influenced architects across Italy and helped establish architecture as an intellectual discipline as well as a practical craft. By the late 15th century, these developments culminated in what later historians would call the High Renaissance. Artists sought balanced composition, idealized anatomy, and controlled perspective. The goal was unity within complexity. In Florence and Rome, painters such as Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael emerged as leading figures. Each approached art differently, yet all benefited from earlier experiments in perspective, anatomy, and natural observation. Leonardo investigated light and shadow with extraordinary subtlety. His technique of sfumato softened transitions between tones, creating atmospheric depth and ambiguous expressions. Michelangelo's sculptural training informed his painted figures, which appeared powerful and grounded. Raphael integrated compositional clarity with graceful expression. Artistic innovation did not occur in isolation. Scientific curiosity supported the study of anatomy through dissection and improved understanding of musculature. Observation of nature encouraged the accurate rendering of plants, landscapes, and changing atmospheric conditions. Patronage shaped subject matter as well. Papal commissions in Rome encouraged grand fresco cycles. Julius II hired Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, combining biblical narrative with monumental scale. Raphael's School of Athens depicted classical philosophers within a coherent architectural space, reflecting humanist admiration for antiquity. Meanwhile, in Venice, artists such as Giovanni Bellini and later Titian emphasized color and atmospheric light, demonstrating that Renaissance innovation could follow different regional paths while remaining connected to a shared culture of artistic inquiry. Venice's maritime commerce reinforced this regional character by giving painters access to pigments and artistic influences from across the Mediterranean. More broadly, the transformation of Renaissance art reflected a change in how Europeans understood both humanity and the visible world. The human body appeared as a dignified structure worthy of careful investigation. Pictorial space became measurable rather than merely symbolic, while architecture expressed rational proportion and order. These developments emerged gradually through workshops, debates, experiments, and commissions. Renaissance art did not abruptly replace medieval traditions. It adapted and extended them. By the early 16th century, travelers through Italian cities encountered churches, palaces, and public buildings shaped by a new visual language. Frescoes seemed to open walls onto believable spaces. Sculptures stood independently instead of functioning only as architectural decoration. Buildings drew their harmony from geometry and classical precedent. Underlying these achievements was curiosity disciplined by method. Artists observed, measured, calculated, and revised, while patrons financed projects and often influenced their subjects. Together, they created a visual culture that would shape European art for centuries. Among the artists whose reputations spread far beyond Italy, Leonardo da Vinci became famous for both his technical ability and the extraordinary range of his interests. Born in 1452 in the Tuscan town of Vinci, he entered the Florentine workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio as a young apprentice. There, he studied drawing, painting, sculpture, metalworking, and mechanical arts. Even at an early stage, however, his curiosity extended beyond the boundaries of any single profession. Leonardo treated painting as a form of investigation. His notebooks contain observations about light, shadow, movement, and proportion, along with anatomical drawings based on human dissection. He examined muscles and bones, sketched plants and animals, studied the motion of water, and designed an astonishing variety of machines. Much of his writing runs from right to left in mirror script, perhaps because this felt natural to him as a left-handed writer. Whatever the reason, the notebooks reveal a mind constantly questioning how the visible world worked. While serving Ludovico Sforza in Milan, Leonardo produced works that united scientific observation with artistic composition. In The Last Supper, painted in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, he arranged the apostles in balanced groups around Christ. Lines of perspective converge behind Christ's head, making geometry direct the viewer's attention. At the same time, each apostle responds differently to the announcement of betrayal. Gesture, posture, and facial expression transform a sacred scene into a study of individual psychology. Leonardo, nevertheless, developed a reputation for leaving projects unfinished. His attention repeatedly shifted toward military engineering, canal systems, architecture, anatomy, and the possibility of human flight. He designed weapons as well as machines intended for practical labor. Many could not have been built successfully with the materials available to him, but their significance lies in the habits of mind they demonstrate. For Leonardo, art, mechanics, and natural philosophy belonged to a single effort to understand the world through observation. Michelangelo Buonarroti pursued a different path. Born in 1475, he spent part of his early career studying classical sculpture in the Medici Garden in Florence. His Pietà, completed in Rome while he was still young, displayed remarkable command of marble. The work combined anatomical precision with an atmosphere of restrained sorrow. Where Leonardo moved among many fields, Michelangelo concentrated with exceptional intensity on the human body as the chief vehicle of emotional and spiritual meaning. That emphasis shaped his work on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Although Michelangelo considered himself primarily a sculptor, he approached the enormous painted surface with a sculptor's concern for volume, physical force, and monumental form. Muscular figures occupy a painted architectural framework, while scenes from Genesis unfold along the chapel's central axis. Biblical narrative is expressed through bodies whose proportions and poses reveal close engagement with classical art. Completing the project demanded years of difficult labor and required the coordination of a complex workshop. Michelangelo's David, carved from a single block of marble, also joined artistic achievement to civic identity. Unlike representations showing David after his victory over Goliath, Michelangelo depicted him in a moment of concentrated anticipation. His balanced stance suggests control, while his gaze and tense hands imply readiness for action. Originally installed near Florence's seat of government, the statue came to symbolize the Republic's determination to defend its independence during a period of political uncertainty. Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael are frequently presented as the defining masters of the High Renaissance, but none worked in isolation. Their careers depended on networks of assistants, court officials, church leaders, civic institutions, and wealthy patrons. Papal ambition shaped the decoration of Rome, just as Republican pride influenced commissions in Florence. Artistic choices emerged from negotiations involving theology, politics, money, available materials, and the practical demands of particular spaces. Renaissance ideas also traveled beyond Italy and changed as they entered different cultural settings. Northern European artists had already developed traditions of meticulous realism, especially through oil painting in the Low Countries. Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg traveled to Italy, where he studied proportion and perspective. After returning north, he combined Italian ideas about compositional structure with a Germanic concern for precise surfaces and minute detail. His woodcuts and engravings circulated widely, allowing his reputation to reach audiences who never saw an original painting by him. Printmaking transformed the movement of both images and knowledge. Woodcuts and engravings could be produced in multiple copies and transported across political boundaries. Illustrated treatises spread methods of perspective, proportion, fortification, and anatomy. Artists could study compositions created in distant cities, while scholars could compare evidence more easily than before. Reproduction changed artistic fame as well. A recognizable image could become influential far from the place where it had first been made. The same emphasis on observation affected the study of nature. Nicolaus Copernicus proposed that Earth moved around the Sun, challenging astronomical systems inherited from ancient and medieval authorities. Andreas Vesalius used direct dissection to correct long-repeated errors in anatomical writings. Neither scholar rejected earlier learning entirely, but both demonstrated that established texts could be tested against evidence. Their methods paralleled the artist's practice of examining bodies, light, movement, and space, rather than relying solely on inherited formulas. War helped carry these methods outward. After the Italian Wars began in 1494, foreign armies repeatedly invaded the peninsula, and the sack of Rome in 1527 disrupted one of Europe's greatest artistic centers. Displaced artists brought their techniques to new courts and cities. At the same time, demand for art expanded beyond rulers and churches. Merchants, officials, and educated professionals increasingly commissioned portraits that recorded social standing while presenting each sitter as a distinct individual worthy of close attention. Households gradually accumulated printed materials. Almanacs provided calendars and practical advice. Prayer books guided devotion. Broadsheets announced political events, military victories, and unusual occurrences. Although many people remained unable to read, printed images and public readings extended the reach of written culture. In marketplaces and churches, texts were read aloud to listeners who could not purchase books themselves. Print, therefore, created both private and collective forms of engagement with knowledge. The expansion of printing also encouraged new forms of authorship. Writers could address a larger and more varied audience than earlier manuscript culture had allowed. Some composed in Latin for scholars, while others chose vernacular languages to reach merchants, artisans, women, and members of the urban middle classes. Religious reformers used accessible prose to explain doctrine, but secular writers also benefited from expanding markets. Histories, romances, travel narratives, and collections of poetry found readers in towns across Europe. The boundaries between learned and popular culture became more permeable, even though social distinctions remained strong. Women participated in this literary world in several ways. Noble women and members of wealthy urban families sometimes maintained libraries, corresponded with scholars, or commissioned translations. A smaller number wrote and published works of their own. Printing made it possible for female authors to reach audiences beyond their immediate households, though social expectations and limited educational opportunities restricted participation. Religious women produced devotional writings, while aristocratic women used poetry and letters to express intellectual and political concerns. Their presence revealed that Renaissance culture, despite its male-dominated institutions, was not created by men alone. The growth of print also transformed the relationship between image and text. Illustrated books combined written explanation with visual instruction. Anatomical studies, botanical manuals, and technical treatises used detailed images to communicate information that words alone could not easily convey. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks had remained large private, but later artists and scientists increasingly understood the value of publishing observations in reproducible form. Images could be examined by readers far from the place where an experiment, monument, or specimen had first been encountered. Knowledge became more portable and more open to comparison. This transformation was especially important in medicine. Physicians revisited ancient authorities while also recording direct observations of the human body. Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist working in Italy, published De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543. Its carefully constructed illustrations challenged inherited assumptions and demonstrated the importance of dissection. Vesalius did not reject the ancient tradition entirely. Instead, he used observation to correct errors that had accumulated through reliance on older texts. His work exemplified a broader Renaissance tendency to respect antiquity while testing its claims against experience. Natural history developed along similar lines. European collectors gathered plants, animals, minerals, and artifacts from distant regions. Botanical gardens were established near universities and courts, allowing scholars to study living specimens. Illustrations helped identify plants and compare examples from different locations. The arrival of American crops, such as maize, tobacco, and potatoes, gradually expanded European knowledge of the natural world, even though these materials were often interpreted through existing theories. Exploration, therefore, produced not only commercial opportunities, but also conceptual challenges. Economic change supported these intellectual developments. Banking families, merchant companies, and commercial networks connected cities across the continent. Florence, Venice, Antwerp, Lyon, Augsburg, and London became important centers of exchange. Credit enabled rulers and entrepreneurs to finance buildings, workshops, ships, and printing enterprises. Wealth circulated unevenly, however. The prosperity of merchants and courts existed alongside poverty among laborers, rural communities, and displaced populations. Renaissance culture depended upon systems of production that could be both innovative and exploitative. Cities themselves became laboratories of social change. Their populations included artisans, immigrants, clerks, students, servants, and merchants from many regions. Guilds regulated work and protected established privileges, while workshops trained younger generations through apprenticeship. The same workshop might produce religious paintings, portraits, furniture, maps, or printed illustrations, according to changing demand. Artists increasingly signed their works, cultivated reputations, and negotiated contracts, yet they still relied on patrons, suppliers, and organized labor. The celebrated individual remained embedded within a wider economic structure. Political power shaped culture just as strongly. Italian states competed through military alliances, diplomacy, and artistic display. Courts hired architects and painters to strengthen dynastic legitimacy. Portraits presented rulers as disciplined, learned, and worthy of obedience. Public festivals combined music, sculpture, temporary architecture, and theatrical performance into carefully planned demonstrations of authority. Elsewhere, monarchies used Renaissance education and symbolism to centralize administration. Humanist secretaries drafted eloquent documents, historians celebrated royal ancestry, and architects expressed political order through palaces and fortifications. Yet this cultural confidence faced serious limits. Religious division produced censorship, persecution, and violence. Governments and church authorities attempted to control books through licensing, indexes, and inquisitorial investigations. Intellectuals sometimes altered or concealed their arguments to avoid punishment. The same printing networks that spread reformist ideas could also distribute polemics, rumors, and accusations. Knowledge became more accessible, but access did not guarantee tolerance. Public debate could encourage critical inquiry while simultaneously intensifying hostility between communities. By the later 16th century, Renaissance culture had become deeply international. Italian artistic principles circulated through courts in France, Spain, the German states, and the Netherlands. Printed books connected scholars who never met in person. Religious reform reshaped education and political allegiance. Exploration widened geographical horizons, while new methods in anatomy, astronomy, cartography, and natural history challenged inherited explanations. Europe did not suddenly abandon the medieval past. Instead, older traditions were reorganized within institutions and technologies capable of carrying ideas farther and preserving them more consistently. The Renaissance was therefore more than a revival of classical art. It was a transformation in the ways Europeans represented the world, organized knowledge, displayed power, and understood individual identity. Its achievements emerged from the interaction of artists, patrons, printers, merchants, scholars, artisans, and religious communities. Painting and sculpture remained visible expressions of the age, but they formed only one part of a larger movement. Behind every celebrated masterpiece stood networks of education, finance, labor, communication, and belief. Those networks ensured that Renaissance ideas would continue to influence European culture long after the original centers of innovation had declined. Broadsheets and pamphlets offered entertainment as well as news, allowing information to move more rapidly than in previous centuries. The economic consequences were significant. Printing houses required investment in type, paper, presses, and skilled labor, while cities such as Venice, Antwerp, and Lyon became major centers of the book trade. International fairs helped merchants exchange printed goods across Europe. Print also strengthened the Renaissance commitment to returning to original sources. Scholars compared manuscripts, corrected translations, and debated competing interpretations. Textual criticism developed into a method grounded in evidence rather than tradition alone. Artistic treatises spread technical knowledge beyond regional boundaries. Manuals on perspective, anatomy, and architecture circulated among practitioners, allowing young artists in Northern Europe to study Italian theories without traveling to Italy. At the same time, religious conflict intensified. Wars of religion erupted across parts of Europe during the 16th century. France experienced decades of violence between Catholic and Protestant factions, while the Holy Roman Empire faced divisions formalized in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. The agreement allowed rulers to determine the official religion of their territory. England's break with Rome under Henry VIII created a national church under royal authority. Later reigns alternated between Protestant and Catholic leadership, reflecting political as well as theological concerns. Printed Bibles in English influenced popular devotion and encouraged lay people to engage directly with religious texts. The Catholic Church responded to the challenges of the Reformation through renewed artistic patronage and institutional reform. Baroque art emerged in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, emphasizing emotional intensity, movement, dramatic light, and direct engagement with viewers. Although stylistically different from the balance associated with the High Renaissance, Baroque culture built upon earlier foundations. Artists continued to draw on classical forms while using them to communicate religious conviction and reinforce the authority of the church. Scientific thought also advanced gradually. Tycho Brahe collected astronomical data with remarkable precision, and Johannes Kepler later used mathematical analysis to formulate his laws of planetary motion. Their work depended on printed tables, instruments, and correspondence networks that connected scholars across Europe. Printing did not eliminate disagreement, but it made evidence easier to compare and preserved observations for future investigators. Urban life reflected increasing complexity. News sheets reported political developments, while pamphlets debated policy, taxation, and religious affairs. Literacy rates rose slowly and unevenly, yet they expanded enough to create a broader reading public. Printing, therefore, served as both an instrument and a catalyst. It did not create the Renaissance, but it accelerated its spread. Ideas that once required years to travel could circulate within months. Scholars became part of a republic of letters connected through printed words. As the 17th century approached, Europe's intellectual landscape bore the marks of this transformation. Religious pluralism, scientific debate, and artistic diversity characterized the era. The press stood quietly behind these changes, multiplying voices and preserving arguments. The Renaissance, initially rooted in Italian humanism and artistic experimentation, had become a continent-wide process. It reshaped education, faith, governance, and daily reading habits, extending beyond elite courts into urban households. The habits formed during the Renaissance, questioning texts, observing nature, and cultivating individual expression, would guide later developments. Scientific inquiry would deepen, political authority would centralize in some regions and fragment in others, and global trade would intensify. By this stage, the Renaissance could no longer be described as an Italian movement alone. Its ideas, styles, and methods had begun adapting to conditions across Northern Europe. Climate, religious traditions, and political structures shaped distinct expressions of the same intellectual current. In the Low Countries, prosperous cities such as Antwerp and Bruges benefited from trade networks linking the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Merchants exchanged textiles, metals, and luxury goods, while urban wealth supported artists committed to close observation. Oil painting, refined by Jan van Eyck and other northern artists, permitted subtle gradations of light and texture. Fabrics, metal, skin, and glass appeared with extraordinary precision. Northern painters approached realism through detailed observation rather than classical proportion. Interiors included books, candles, fruit, and instruments, many of which carried symbolic meanings while grounding sacred scenes in everyday life. Portraits presented merchants and civic leaders with quiet dignity. Albrecht Dürer traveled from Nuremberg to Italy in the 1490s, where he studied perspective and proportion. He recognized that Italian artists relied on mathematical systems to construct space. After returning home, he published treatises explaining geometry and human measurement. His engravings circulated widely, bridging northern detail with Italian structure. Humanism also reached the north through scholarship. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam edited and published a new Latin translation of the New Testament based on Greek manuscripts. He advocated moral reform within the Church, emphasizing inner piety and classical learning. His writings traveled throughout Europe through print, influencing Catholic and Protestant readers alike. In England, Thomas More engaged with humanist thought. His utopia imagined a society organized by reason and communal responsibility, reflecting Renaissance interest in classical philosophy and civic ethics. English grammar schools adopted humanist curricula that taught Latin rhetoric and classical history. France absorbed Renaissance culture through court patronage, while Francis I invited Italian artists, including Leonardo da Vinci, to his court. French chateaux combined classical architectural elements with local traditions. Spain's Renaissance developed amid political unification and overseas expansion. Wealth from colonial territories financed artistic projects and educational institutions. Universities such as Salamanca incorporated humanist studies alongside theology. Voyages by Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan expanded geographical knowledge. Printed maps recorded these discoveries, while new plants, animals, and commodities entered European markets. Tomatoes, potatoes, and maize gradually became part of European diets. Silver from the Americas increased Europe's money supply and contributed to price fluctuations known as the Price Revolution. Merchant networks expanded still further, linking Renaissance Europe to an increasingly global economy. Cities such as Seville and Lisbon became gateways for overseas trade, connecting European merchants with Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Intellectual curiosity expanded alongside commerce. Scholars cataloged newly encountered species, while botanical gardens were established to study imported plants. Collections of artifacts from distant lands filled cabinets of curiosity, early precursors to modern museums. These collections reflected both wonder and the growing desire to classify the natural and human worlds through observation. Religious tensions continued to shape Northern Europe. In Germany, Lutheran territories reorganized church governance, while in Switzerland, reform movements led by Huldrych Zwingli and later John Calvin emphasized different theological principles. Calvin's teachings influenced communities in France, the Netherlands, Scotland, and beyond. These developments affected artistic production. In Protestant regions, religious imagery declined in churches because reformers feared that elaborate images encouraged idolatry. Artists redirected their attention toward portraiture, landscape, still life, and scenes of ordinary life. In Catholic territories, the Counter-Reformation encouraged clear, emotionally compelling art that reinforced church doctrine and inspired devotion. Architecture also developed along distinct regional paths. In England, classical elements gradually appeared within Tudor structures. In Spain, the Plateresque style combined Renaissance ornament with local traditions, producing richly decorated facades. German builders created their own variations, blending Gothic forms with classical details. These differences demonstrated that the Renaissance was not a single, uniform style. Instead, its principles were adapted to local materials, religious conditions, political structures, and cultural expectation. Education broadened during the same period. Protestant communities established schools to promote literacy, especially so that believers could read the Bible. Catholic reformers expanded seminaries and colleges to train clergy and defend church teaching. Universities incorporated new scientific and philosophical discussions while retaining traditional subjects such as grammar, rhetoric, logic, and theology. Scientific inquiry accelerated during the late 16th century. Improved instruments allowed astronomers to make more precise observations. Galileo Galilei's telescopic discoveries, including lunar craters and the moons of Jupiter, challenged Aristotelian cosmology and offered support for a changing understanding of the heaven. Although controversy followed, his findings circulated widely through books, letters, and learned networks. Philosophical debate deepened as thinkers questioned inherited frameworks and explored empirical methods. Francis Bacon in England advocated systematic observation and experimentation. Although much of his work belongs to the 17th century, it emerged from Renaissance confidence in human inquiry. Knowledge, he argued, should be developed through organized investigation, rather than accepted solely because ancient authorities had endorsed it. Literature flourished in vernacular languages. In England, William Shakespeare's plays combined classical themes with contemporary concerns. His works explored character, political ambition, love, violence, and moral complexity, reflecting Renaissance interest in human motives and social conflict. In Spain, Miguel de Cervantes published Don Quixote, blending satire with reflection on chivalric ideals and the gap between imagination and reality. Music also developed greater polyphonic richness. Composers such as Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina in Rome created sacred compositions whose clarity suited Counter-Reformation ideals. Secular madrigals spread through courts and households, combining poetry with layered harmony and expressive vocal lines. Daily life in Northern Europe gradually incorporated Renaissance influences. Merchants displayed imported goods, while homes contained printed books, maps, and decorative objects inspired by classical motifs. Clothing reflected both local climates and changing patterns of wealth. By the early 17th century, the Renaissance spirit had permeated much of Europe, though it did not erase regional identity. Instead, it provided shared references, classical texts, perspective theory, humanist education, and ideals of civic life that different societies interpreted according to their own circumstances. The movement's expansion prepared the ground for further transformation. The scientific revolution, religious conflict, and political centralization would reshape Europe in the decades ahead. The Renaissance had encouraged the study of antiquity and the careful observation of nature. These habits guided thinkers beyond the intellectual framework of the 15th century. What began as a revival of classical learning in Italian city-states became a continental shift in how knowledge was gathered, art was created, and authority was questioned. As Renaissance ideas spread, they entered courts and governments where power was being reorganized. Monarchies in France, Spain, and England strengthened their administrative systems, and diplomacy became more formal. Written correspondence, often shaped by humanist rhetoric, structured negotiations between states. Italy remained divided and vulnerable to foreign intervention. The Italian Wars, beginning in 1494, involved France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and numerous Italian states. Armies crossed the peninsula repeatedly, cities were besieged, and alliances shifted. This instability revealed the limits of small republics when confronted by centralized monarchies. Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat and political thinker, observed these changes closely. After serving the Republic on diplomatic missions, he experienced exile when the Medici returned to power. During this period, he wrote The Prince, a treatise analyzing how rulers acquired and maintained authority. Machiavelli emphasized calculation, decisiveness, and adaptability rather than moral idealism. Drawing on Roman history and contemporary politics, he examined human behavior as it operated in government, not merely as it ought to operate. His controversial analysis contributed to emerging concepts of statecraft grounded in observation. Elsewhere, monarchs consolidated power through bureaucratic systems. Spain strengthened royal institutions and extended administrative control into overseas colonies. The flow of American silver increased royal revenue, but also contributed to inflation. France developed centralized courts, legal reforms, and a growing reliance on resident ambassadors. In England, Henry VIII's break with Rome transferred ecclesiastical authority to the crown, while the dissolution of monasteries redistributed land and wealth. Under Elizabeth I, religious compromise accompanied cultural flourishing, literature, and exploration. The Holy Roman Empire remained a mosaic of principalities and free cities. The Reformation fragmented religious unity, and the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 granted local rulers authority to determine religious practice within their territories. Political identity became closely connected to confessional allegiance. Throughout this changing landscape, diplomatic correspondence reflected humanist education. Letters were composed in polished Latin or increasingly refined vernacular languages, and rhetorical skill enhanced political credibility. Classical history offered diplomats and officials models of governance, civic virtue, and political decline. At the same time, urban governments developed more systematic methods of administration. Councils preserved detailed records, financial offices monitored revenue, and taxation increasingly supported permanent armies rather than temporary feudal levies. Such changes strengthened rulers' ability to govern, but they also placed heavier demands on local communities. Military technology encouraged further centralization. Gunpowder artillery made many medieval walls vulnerable, prompting engineers to develop the defensive system known as the Trace Italienne. Low, thick walls and star-shaped bastions were designed to withstand cannon fire and expose attackers to overlapping fields of fire. Constructing these fortifications required specialized knowledge, coordinated labor, and substantial public funding. Architects, mathematicians, and military engineers therefore became important participants in the planning of cities and states. Commercial interests also influenced political decisions. Governments treated control of ports and trade routes as a strategic priority. Venice defended its maritime territories, while Portugal and Spain competed for access to overseas markets and resources. Scholars frequently served rulers as advisors, secretaries, and legal experts, and universities educated administrators capable of managing expanding bureaucracies. Printing accelerated the circulation of political arguments, allowing official declarations, critical pamphlets, and competing accounts of events to reach audiences more rapidly than before. The concept of sovereignty gradually acquired greater importance. In France, Jean Baudin argued for a unified and enduring authority within the state, believing that political unity could protect society from disorder. His ideas reflected the turmoil of the French Wars of Religion, in which Catholics and Huguenots struggled for influence. The Street. Bartholomew's Day Massacre of 1572, during which thousands of Protestants were killed, horrified observers across Europe and demonstrated the destructive potential of confessional conflict. In the Netherlands, resistance to Spanish rule combined religious division with economic and political grievances. The Dutch revolt eventually led the northern provinces to establish an independent republic. Amsterdam became a major commercial center, benefiting from maritime trade, skilled immigration, and a degree of religious tolerance unusual for the period. These developments showed that political innovation could emerge not only from centralized monarchies, but also from federations of provinces and urban communities. Renaissance political culture did not eliminate violence, rivalry, or oppression. Instead, it supplied new tools for analyzing and administering power. Classical texts informed discussions of republican government, monarchy, and empire, while humanist education prepared officials to negotiate alliances and manage correspondence. Civic identity remained powerful in Italian cities, although foreign intervention increasingly limited their independence. Florence alternated between Medici government and republican experiments, while the papacy combined spiritual authority with territorial ambition. Art reinforced these political claims. Portraits projected dignity, monuments commemorated victories, and palaces represented stability, wealth, and legitimate rule. Economic conditions were changing as well. Atlantic commerce shifted Europe's economic center of gravity toward Western seaboard powers. Lisbon, Seville, and later Amsterdam gained prominence, while Mediterranean cities adapted to altered trading patterns. Population growth placed pressure on agricultural production, and cooler conditions during parts of the late 16th century contributed to poor harvests. Some governments attempted to regulate grain supplies, control prices, or prevent hoarding, though their capacity to relieve hunger remained limited. Debates over law, religion, taxation, and government filled printed books and pamphlets. Political awareness spread beyond court circles, even if literacy and direct participation remained uneven. By the early 17th century, Renaissance political transformation was merging into the formation of early modern states. Administrative systems had become more elaborate, armies larger and more permanent, and diplomacy continuous rather than occasional. Critical reading, classical comparison, and rhetorical training did not guarantee peace or justice, but they changed how Europeans understood authority and public life. The Italian city-states that had fostered early humanism no longer dominated European affairs, yet their institutional and intellectual experiments influenced larger political structures. Letters, laws, fortifications, fiscal systems, and diplomatic practices all bore the Renaissance imprint. Europe entered the 17th century as a landscape of powerful monarchies, resilient republics, competing empires, and territories divided by confession. It also faced further upheaval through war, colonial expansion, and new approaches to knowledge. As printing transformed communication and humanist methods encouraged critical inquiry, scholars increasingly directed their attention toward the natural world. Curiosity, once concentrated on recovering classical manuscripts, expanded into the observation of the heavens, the human body, and physical motion. This development did not simply reject earlier learning. It adapted the humanist practice of consulting original sources, comparing interpretations, and questioning accumulated errors. Astronomy provided one of the clearest examples. For centuries, European cosmology had relied on the Ptolemaic system, which placed Earth at the center of nested celestial spheres. Medieval scholars had refined this geocentric model and incorporated it into broader philosophical and theological frameworks. Yet persistent differences between predicted and observed planetary movements encouraged reconsideration. Nicolaus Copernicus, born in 1473 in Royal Prussia, studied mathematics and astronomy as well as law and medicine. After decades of calculation, he proposed that Earth and the other planets revolved around the Sun. His De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, published in 1543, described this heliocentric system. Copernicus dedicated the work to Pope Paul III, illustrating the complicated relationship between scholarly innovation and religious authority. Heliocentrism did not immediately replace established cosmology. Its mathematical order attracted some specialists, while others treated it as a useful calculating device rather than a literal description of the universe. Improved observations nevertheless strengthened the movement toward a new astronomy. The Danish nobleman Tycho Brahe constructed sophisticated observatories and recorded planetary positions with exceptional precision. Although he rejected a fully heliocentric universe, his measurements gave Johannes Kepler the evidence needed to demonstrate that planets traveled in elliptical rather than perfectly circular orbits. In the early 17th century, Galileo Galilei improved the telescope and directed it toward the sky. He observed mountains on the moon, the phases of Venus, and moons orbiting Jupiter. These discoveries challenged the assumption that all celestial bodies were perfect or revolved around Earth, opening a new stage in the transformation of European science. Galileo published his results in accessible language, reaching a wider audience than many earlier astronomical works. The Church initially responded with caution rather than immediate condemnation. However, as heliocentrism gained public attention and appeared to contradict certain scriptural interpretations, tension increased. Galileo's trial in 1633 marked a moment when scientific method and ecclesiastical authority confronted one another directly. Though forced to recant publicly, his work continued to circulate. The episode revealed that debates about knowledge involved not only evidence, but also institutions, interpretation, and the boundaries of authority. Anatomy also advanced during this period. Andreas Vesalius, born in Brussels in 1514, conducted systematic dissections that corrected errors inherited from ancient authorities such as Galen. His book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, presented detailed illustrations of the human body. Produced with exceptional artistic precision, these images demonstrated how Renaissance art and science intersected. The study of musculature and bone structure informed medicine, while it also supplied painters and sculptors with a more accurate understanding of the human form. In England, William Harvey later described the circulation of blood, building on anatomical knowledge accumulated during the Renaissance. His experiments relied on direct observation, comparison, and quantitative reasoning. Natural philosophy broadened beyond astronomy and anatomy. Scholars investigated magnetism, mechanics, and optics, while instruments such as microscopes and improved lenses expanded the scale of observation. Although many conclusions would later be revised, the method of inquiry shifted toward experimentation and measurement. This transformation was gradual and uneven. Universities retained traditional curricula alongside new studies, and Aristotelian philosophy remained influential. Yet a space had opened for questioning and revision. Printing remained essential to this process. Scientific treatises could include diagrams, tables, and illustrations that were reproduced across Europe. Correspondence networks allowed scholars to compare results, criticize arguments, and refine observations. The Republic of Letters, as this international community was sometimes called, connected thinkers from different regions through shared curiosity. Renaissance education had emphasized rhetoric, grammar, and classical history. Now mathematics gained increasing importance. Geometry, once primarily a tool for artists and architects, became central to scientific reasoning. Calculations increasingly supplemented purely qualitative descriptions, while philosophical reflection accompanied empirical work. In France, René Descartes sought systematic doubt as a path to certainty. His approach emphasized reason as a foundation for knowledge. Although his philosophy extended beyond the Renaissance period, it emerged from intellectual currents shaped by earlier humanist inquiry. The relationship between science and religion during this era was complex. Many scientists remained devout and viewed the study of nature as a way of understanding divine creation. Conflicts arose not from simple opposition, but from differing interpretations of authority, evidence, and scripture. Technological innovation influenced daily life gradually. Improved navigation techniques supported long-distance voyages, while advances in metallurgy strengthened artillery, tools, and other equipment. Agricultural practices adapted to crops introduced from overseas. The Renaissance habit of returning to original sources extended to biblical scholarship as well. Scholars examined Hebrew and Greek texts in order to refine translations and clarify meanings. This textual analysis paralleled scientific scrutiny of inherited cosmologies. By the early 17th century, the cumulative effect of these investigations had reshaped European thought. The cosmos appeared less fixed and more dynamic. The human body became an object of systematic study, and knowledge seemed expandable rather than closed. This transformation did not erase tradition immediately. Religious institutions continued to shape education and governance, and older explanations remained influential. Yet, intellectual confidence in observation and calculation marked a departure from medieval reliance on commentary alone. Art and science remained intertwined. Anatomical drawings informed painters, while geometric perspective influenced astronomers and map-makers. A shared interest in proportion, structure, and measurement linked disciplines that had previously been treated as separate. As political tensions mounted toward the 30 Years' War, which began in 1618, Europe entered a period of extended conflict. Even amid warfare, however, scientific exchange persisted. Scholars corresponded across confessional lines, preserving networks of inquiry despite religious and political divisions. The Renaissance had begun with the rediscovery of classical antiquity, but it matured into a culture that valued investigation across multiple fields. The scientific developments of this era would later be labeled the Scientific Revolution. Their roots, however, lay in habits formed during the Renaissance: critical reading, careful observation, mathematical reasoning, and a willingness to revise inherited models. While scholars measured planets and dissected bodies, European ships were crossing oceans with increasing regularity. The Renaissance had encouraged curiosity about classical geography, yet ancient maps described only a limited world. Mariners of the 15th and 16th centuries gradually replaced inherited outlines with first-hand observation. Exploration reshaped economic structures and intellectual assumptions alike. Portuguese voyages along the western coast of Africa during the 15th century marked an early stage of this outward movement. Supported by Prince Henry the Navigator, expeditions sought trade routes that bypassed established Mediterranean intermediaries. Caravels designed for ocean travel allowed sailors to navigate unfamiliar waters. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by rounding the Cape of Good Hope, establishing a sea route that linked Europe directly to Asian markets. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west under Spanish patronage, hoping to reach Asia across the Atlantic. Instead, he encountered lands unknown to Europeans. Subsequent voyages revealed that these territories formed continents previously uncharted in European geography. The term New World entered circulation, reflecting both novelty and misunderstanding. The consequences were extensive. Spanish expeditions under Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro conquered large indigenous empires in Mexico and Peru. These conquests, facilitated by military technology and disease, brought vast quantities of silver to Europe. Colonial administration followed, integrating overseas territories into European political systems. Portugal established trading posts in Africa, India, and later Brazil. Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence were formalized through treaties that divided overseas claims, although other European powers soon challenged this dominance. The influx of silver altered European economies. An increased money supply contributed to sustained price inflation during the 16th century. Wages did not always keep pace, affecting urban laborers and rural peasants differently. Governments adapted fiscal policies to manage new revenue streams, while trade networks expanded dramatically. Spices from Asia, sugar from Caribbean plantations, and textiles from distant markets entered Europe through ports such as Seville and Lisbon, while Antwerp grew into a commercial hub connecting northern and southern routes. Economic change brought cultural exchange as well. Scholars studied unfamiliar plants, animals, and peoples, and printed reports by travelers and missionaries circulated widely. Curiosity about distant regions complemented the Renaissance fascination with geography and natural history. Yet overseas expansion also deepened exploitation. Plantation labor demands accelerated the transatlantic slave trade, drawing African societies into coercive networks shaped by European consumption. Cartography advanced alongside navigation. Maps incorporated newly charted coastlines, and Gerardus Mercator's 1569 projection gave sailors a practical way to plot courses despite greatly enlarging lands at high latitudes. Printed atlases helped merchants, officials, and rulers imagine empires on a global scale. Overseas wealth strengthened monarchies but sharpened rivalry, making naval power an important measure of state capacity. England and the Netherlands built fleets to contest Iberian dominance. Catholic and Protestant missionaries likewise followed merchants and soldiers, establishing churches and schools across the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Conversion often became inseparable from political control. Imported goods altered consumption within Europe. Sugar, once an expensive rarity, became more widely available, while tobacco spread quickly after its introduction. Chocolate and coffee entered European diets more gradually, eventually encouraging new rituals of sociability and commercial enterprise. Oceanic travel also stimulated mathematics, astronomy, and instrument making. Determining longitude remained extremely difficult, but the astrolabe and other improved devices made navigation more precise. Later instruments, including the sextant, extended that progress. Shipbuilding changed to support longer voyages, larger cargoes, and dangerous crossings over unfamiliar seas. Humanists had revered ancient geographers, especially Ptolemy, but contemporary voyages now demonstrated how incomplete classical descriptions of the world had been. European self-understanding shifted as a result. Encounters overseas also provoked moral and philosophical disputes. Bartolomé de las Casas condemned the brutal treatment of indigenous peoples and defended their humanity and rights. Debates in Spain examined whether conquest could be justified and how conquered populations should be governed. Such arguments did not end colonial violence, but they exposed tensions among Christian morality, legal reasoning, imperial ambition, and the pursuit of wealth. Meanwhile, the center of European commerce moved westward as Atlantic routes surpassed many Mediterranean networks in importance. Italian city-states, long prominent in international trade, faced growing competition from Atlantic ports. By the 17th century, Amsterdam had emerged as a financial and maritime powerhouse. Joint stock companies allowed investors to share both the risks and profits of distant ventures. The Dutch East India Company and English East India Company combined commercial activity with quasi-governmental powers, maintaining armed forces, negotiating treaties, administering settlements, and exercising authority over overseas populations. Classical learning did not disappear amid this global expansion. Instead, it supplied categories through which Europeans attempted to interpret unfamiliar realities. Scholars compared indigenous societies with ancient civilizations, and writers framed descriptions of foreign customs with references to Greece and Rome. Knowledge and materials nevertheless moved in multiple directions. European crops and domesticated animals transformed American environments, while American plants, such as maize and potatoes, eventually reshaped European agriculture. Global exchange was reciprocal in movement, though profoundly unequal in power, wealth, and human cost. European cities visibly reflected these developments. Warehouses held imported commodities, financial markets processed transactions tied to overseas ventures, and insurers devised methods for distributing maritime risk. Exploration also transformed the imagination. Travel narratives described distant wonders and dangers, encouraging curiosity, investment, and ambition. Cartographic images appeared in books and on walls, reinforcing awareness of the world's scale. As the 17th century approached, Europe's connections with other continents had become permanent. Maritime routes sustained exchanges of goods, people, knowledge, disease, and violence, while political rivalries increasingly extended overseas. The Renaissance had begun as a cultural revival grounded in classical antiquity, but it now intersected with global transformation. Commerce, migration, conquest, and colonization altered populations and economies. Habits of inquiry and calculation developed during the Renaissance became essential for administering empires and managing complex trading systems. Yet change was not confined to courts, ships, and distant colonies. Within European towns, the Renaissance unfolded in kitchens, workshops, classrooms, markets, and parish churches, gradually reshaping ordinary expectations across generations. Urban growth was among the clearest developments between the 14th and 17th centuries. Florence, Venice, Paris, London, and Antwerp all expanded as migrants arrived from the countryside in search of work. Medieval streets remained narrow in many neighborhoods, although some districts gained planned squares and improved public buildings. Markets continued to organize the daily rhythm. Each morning, vendors arranged vegetables, grain, fish, and meat on wooden stalls. Bakers prepared bread in communal ovens, while butchers displayed cuts according to guild regulations. Municipal inspectors monitored weights, prices, and quality because public confidence in trade was vital to urban stability. Guilds structured professional identity by regulating training, standards, and prices. Apprenticeship marked a formal passage toward adulthood. A young apprentice entered a master's household and learned discipline alongside a craft. Years of practice could lead to journeyman status and, for some, eventual mastery. Women also participated actively in urban economies, although usually under significant legal and social constraints. Artisans' wives assisted production and managed accounts. Widows sometimes inherited workshops, and female vendors sold produce and textiles. Their property rights varied by region, while formal political participation generally remained closed to them. Education gradually extended beyond narrow elite circles. Urban schools provided instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic, skills increasingly valuable in commerce and administration. Protestant communities promoted literacy so believers could study the Bible, while Catholic reformers expanded schooling through newly established religious orders. Printed textbooks helped standardize lessons and made instructional material more accessible. As written records became more important to governments, businesses, and churches, literacy offered practical advantages as well as religious and cultural ones. The political changes of the 17th century did not erase Renaissance ideals, but they placed them within stronger systems of state power. Governments expanded bureaucracies, organized permanent armies, and sought more reliable taxation. Officials depended on written reports, maps, censuses, and financial records to administer increasingly complex territories. The same habits of measurement and documentation that had supported commerce and scholarship now served centralized states. Administration became a practical expression of the Renaissance belief that human affairs could be studied, classified, and improved. The 30 Years' War ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The settlement recognized a wider degree of territorial authority for the princes of the Holy Roman Empire and confirmed the political importance of France and Sweden. It did not create the modern nation-state in a complete form, but it contributed to a political landscape in which rulers exercised greater control within defined territories. Religious uniformity remained important, yet political necessity increasingly encouraged negotiation among states with different confessions. Diplomacy became more systematic, relying on permanent representatives, written treaties, and increasingly specialized knowledge. The Dutch Republic offered a different model of political and economic development. Its merchants built a powerful commercial network across the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. Amsterdam became a major center of finance, shipping, publishing, and information exchange. Joint stock companies gathered capital for overseas ventures, while banks and exchanges facilitated transactions across long distances. The Republic's prosperity supported painters, scientists, mapmakers, and printers. Its relative religious diversity attracted migrants and encouraged the circulation of controversial ideas. Yet Dutch wealth also depended on colonial expansion, warfare, and systems of coerced labor. Commercial success and intellectual openness existed alongside exploitation and inequality. The English experience likewise revealed tensions between inherited authority and new political expectations. The civil wars challenged the relationship between king, parliament, and religion. After the execution of Charles I in 1649, England briefly became a republic under Oliver Cromwell, though military government and political division limited the experiment. The monarchy was restored in 1660, but conflicts continued. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 removed James II and established William and Mary under conditions that strengthened Parliament. The English Bill of Rights affirmed limits on royal power and protected certain parliamentary privileges. Political participation remained restricted, but debates over consent, representation, and law acquired lasting influence. Scientific inquiry advanced within this unsettled environment. Galileo's observations had challenged older assumptions about the heavens, and later thinkers developed new methods for explaining motion and matter. Johannes Kepler described planetary movement through mathematical laws. Francis Bacon promoted systematic observation and experimentation, arguing that knowledge should be used to understand and improve the natural world. René Descartes emphasized doubt, reason, and analytical method. Their approaches differed, yet all contributed to a culture that valued investigation over unquestioned reliance on inherited authorities. Isaac Newton brought several strands of this transformation together. In Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, he formulated laws of motion and universal gravitation that explained both earthly movement and celestial bodies through a common mathematical framework. Newton's work did not make earlier Renaissance learning irrelevant. Instead, it extended the period's interest in proportion, nature, and human reason into a more comprehensive scientific system. His achievement encouraged the belief that the universe operated according to discoverable laws. Scientific societies helped institutionalize this new approach. The Royal Society in England, founded in 1660, promoted experiments, observations, and the exchange of findings. Similar academies appeared elsewhere in Europe. Members presented demonstrations, examined instruments, and published reports. Instruments themselves became increasingly important. Telescopes revealed distant celestial details. Microscopes exposed previously invisible structures. Barometers measured atmospheric pressure, and improved clocks supported navigation and astronomy. Knowledge depended not only on individual genius, but also on communities, instruments, funding, and methods for checking evidence. Medicine advanced more slowly, though important developments occurred. William Harvey demonstrated the circulation of blood, challenging long-standing anatomical assumptions. Physicians gradually placed greater emphasis on observation and dissection. Hospitals and charitable institutions expanded in some cities, while public authorities attempted to control outbreaks through quarantine and sanitation measures. Nevertheless, disease remained a major threat. Smallpox, typhus, and other infections caused repeated mortality, and treatments were often ineffective. Scientific confidence grew faster than practical control over illness. Printing continued to connect these developments. Books, pamphlets, scientific journals, and correspondence networks allowed arguments to travel beyond universities and courts. Learned discussions increasingly crossed national and confessional boundaries. Women participated in these networks as patrons, translators, illustrators, and, in some cases, authors and observers, although educational and institutional barriers remained substantial. Salons and private academies provided additional spaces for conversation, especially in cities where formal institutions excluded many people. Religious life also changed without losing its importance. Confessional divisions remained powerful, and rulers continued to use religion to support political authority. At the same time, devotional practice became more varied. Pietist movements emphasized personal faith and disciplined community life. Catholic orders expanded education and missionary work. Religious debate encouraged literacy because believers were urged to read scripture, devotional manuals, and sermons. The result was not a simple decline of religion, but a more diverse religious culture shaped by print, schooling, and organized reform. By the end of the 17th century, Europe had inherited a complex legacy from the Renaissance. Artistic ideals had developed into new styles, humanist education had supported political and scientific debate, and commercial networks had connected distant regions more closely than before. Yet these achievements were inseparable from warfare, imperial expansion, social inequality, and religious conflict. The period's central habits, careful observation, historical comparison, civic organization, artistic experimentation, and confidence in human learning, continued to influence European institutions. The Renaissance, therefore, belonged not only to the 15th and 16th centuries. Its ideas persisted by changing form. Classical scholarship became historical criticism, artistic proportion became new theories of order, and curiosity about nature became experimental science. The 17th century inherited these practices and placed them within stronger states, expanding markets, and increasingly global connections. Europe entered the modern era not through a sudden break with the past, but through the gradual transformation of habits first cultivated during the Renaissance. The Dutch Republic, having secured independence from Spain, established a commercial state grounded in maritime trade. Amsterdam flourished as a financial center, while religious tolerance, though not absolute, allowed diverse communities to coexist. This environment supported printing, philosophy, and art. Books, pamphlets, maps, and scientific reports circulated through a society in which merchants, scholars, and skilled artisans played influential roles. The Republic demonstrated that cultural achievement could develop within a commercial and relatively decentralized political system, not only in royal courts or princely capitals. Scientific inquiry continued to advance. Galileo's earlier observations influenced subsequent thinkers, even after church authorities condemned some of his conclusions. René Descartes proposed analytic geometry and philosophical systems that emphasized rational method. His approach reflected growing confidence that mathematics and disciplined reasoning could reveal the structure of reality. Isaac Newton's work later in the 17th century integrated earlier astronomical discoveries into a comprehensive theory of motion and gravitation. Although Newton's achievements lie beyond the Renaissance proper, they emerged from intellectual groundwork laid during preceding centuries. The Renaissance had encouraged scholars to recover ancient learning, question inherited assumptions, and investigate nature directly. These habits now contributed to the rise of modern science. Artistic style shifted as well. The balanced harmony of the High Renaissance gave way to the dynamism of the Baroque. Caravaggio introduced dramatic contrasts of light and shadow, emphasizing realism and emotional immediacy. His figures appeared physically present, often drawn from ordinary life, while intense illumination directed viewers toward moments of spiritual or psychological crisis. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's sculptures conveyed movement within marble, capturing moments of action rather than static equilibrium. His works seemed to transform stone into living bodies, wind-blown fabric, and sudden movement. These developments responded partly to the Catholic Church's desire for clear, persuasive imagery during the Counter-Reformation. Religious art was expected to communicate doctrine vividly and to engage the emotions of worshippers. In Northern Europe, painters such as Rembrandt and Vermeer depicted domestic interiors, civic groups, and individual portraits with quiet observation. Their works reflected Protestant culture's emphasis on private devotion and civic identity, rather than on grand ecclesiastical commissions. A woman reading, a family gathered in a room, or a merchant posing for a portrait could become a worthy subject. This expansion of subject matter demonstrated how artistic patronage had broadened. Paintings increasingly entered private homes, where they expressed personal identity, prosperity, moral values, and attachment to family life. Economic structures adapted to prolonged warfare and global trade. Banking systems became more sophisticated, insurance markets expanded, and governments borrowed extensively to finance armies and fortifications. Public debt emerged as a central feature of statecraft. Rulers increasingly depended on administrators, financiers, and tax systems capable of supporting permanent military establishments. These developments strengthened central governments, but they also placed heavier burdens on ordinary people. Taxes, inflation, and wartime shortages affected urban laborers and rural peasants unevenly. Commercial growth could create immense wealth while leaving poverty highly visible in the same cities. Education continued evolving. Universities incorporated new scientific texts alongside classical curricula. Grammar schools maintained their emphasis on rhetoric and Latin, ensuring continuity with the humanist tradition. Literacy rates improved gradually, especially in urban centers, where merchants, artisans, officials, and religious communities needed to read contracts, devotional works, newspapers, and correspondence. Printed textbooks helped standardize lessons and made instructional materials more accessible. Education, therefore, served both older humanist purposes and newer administrative, commercial, and scientific needs. The Renaissance legacy also shaped legal thought. The rediscovery and study of Roman law influenced continental legal systems, while the codification of laws reflected a broader commitment to systematic analysis. Legal scholars examined precedents, categories, and written evidence with methods resembling those used by humanists and natural philosophers. Intellectual debate increasingly valued observation, documentation, and argument. The founding of scientific societies in the 17th century, including the Royal Society in England, institutionalized inquiry. Members conducted experiments, recorded observations, exchanged correspondence, and published findings. This formal organization of knowledge grew directly from Renaissance habits of collaboration, collecting, and careful documentation. Meanwhile, colonial expansion continued reshaping Europe's economy and demography. Atlantic trade networks intensified, and plantation systems in the Americas expanded through the forced labor of enslaved Africans. European consumption of sugar, tobacco, and coffee increased, linking everyday habits to distant systems of exploitation. Urban centers reflected new wealth through grand avenues, public buildings, and elaborate residences. At the same time, poverty remained visible among laboring populations, and the prosperity of merchants and states depended upon inequalities that extended across continents. Religious plurality became a permanent feature in parts of Europe. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 recognized the coexistence of multiple confessions within the Holy Roman Empire and marked a turning point in international relations by emphasizing state sovereignty. Religious conflict did not disappear, but political authorities increasingly negotiated treaties and defined borders without expecting a single confession to unite all of Europe. This development helped establish patterns of diplomacy that would shape the modern interstate system. By the late 17th century, Europe's intellectual culture bore marks of both continuity and innovation. Classical texts remained foundational in education, yet new scientific frameworks redefined natural philosophy. Political theory addressed emerging nation-states rather than small republics alone. Newspapers appeared regularly, information circulated more widely, and public opinion gained a subtle influence over political life. The transformation begun in 14th century Italy had extended across continents and centuries. It had survived war, religious division, and economic fluctuation because its institutions, universities, printing houses, libraries, academies, and bureaucracies proved durable. The Renaissance, therefore, appears less as a discrete era than as a gradual shift in orientation. It redirected attention toward classical antiquity, human experience, and empirical observation. These tendencies persisted even as artistic styles and political structures evolved. Europeans increasingly expected that texts could be questioned, that nature could be measured, and that governance could be analyzed. By the end of the 17th century, Europe had entered what historians call the early modern period. The world had grown larger, political systems had become more centralized, and scientific knowledge had become more systematic. The Renaissance did not disappear. It matured into frameworks that shaped Enlightenment thought and beyond. Its achievements lay not only in masterpieces or philosophical treatises, but also in altered habits of thinking. By then, the Renaissance had fulfilled its quiet work. It had carried Europe from medieval inheritance toward modern structures. Its legacy endured because it became embedded in institutions, routines, and expectations, rather than remaining a fleeting cultural fashion. What followed would build upon foundations carefully laid across 3 centuries of gradual change. Their cumulative effects transformed not only institutions, but also the ordinary rhythms of European life. Urban governments, shaped by Renaissance civic reform, increasingly operated through written statutes, recorded proceedings, and permanent offices. Authority still depended on hierarchical and privilege, yet administration became more systematic. Bureaucracies relied on documentation, archiving, and trained personnel. Taxation systems and commercial regulations reflected an administrative sophistication that had developed gradually since the 15th century. The same pattern appeared in artistic education. Workshops and academies formalized training in drawing, anatomy, perspective, and classical composition. Students copied ancient sculptures to study proportion and practiced from living models to understand the structure of the human body. Architectural treatises continued to circulate, ensuring that classical orders remained reference points even as regional styles changed. The Renaissance did not preserve antiquity unchanged. It made antiquity into a flexible language that later generations could adapt. Scientific inquiry also acquired more durable institutions. Societies devoted to observation and experiment held regular meetings, recorded their proceedings, and circulated publications across national borders. Scholars disagreed sharply about interpretation, but the expectation that claims should be supported by evidence became increasingly influential. Method gradually replaced mere authority as a justification for belief. This did not eliminate religion from intellectual life. Many investigators remained deeply religious. Instead, it created additional ways of examining nature, society, and human conduct. The global networks established during Renaissance exploration expanded in scale and consequence. Colonies grew more extensive and complex, while trade routes connected Europe with Africa, Asia, and the Americas through sustained exchange. Commodities such as tea, coffee, sugar, and tobacco entered European markets and eventually became part of everyday routines. Financial systems adapted to manage international investment, insurance, and credit. Ports displayed goods from distant regions, making global connections visible in streets, warehouses, and private homes. Coffee houses became important spaces within this expanding public world. Merchants, writers, officials, and curious readers gathered there to discuss politics, literature, science, and commercial news. Newspapers reported events beyond local and national boundaries, widening public awareness. Information moved more rapidly, though it remained unevenly distributed and often shaped by censorship or political interest. Still, Europeans increasingly imagined themselves as participants in events that exceeded the limits of their town or kingdom. Religious diversity remained a defining feature of many regions. Confessional conflict continued to divide communities, and governments often enforced religious conformity. Yet decades of warfare also encouraged pragmatic tolerance in certain states, especially where commercial stability required cooperation among different groups. Identity continued to be shaped by faith, but coexistence became more common in major trading centers. This compromise was rarely founded on modern equality. It was instead a practical recognition that economic and political life could not always be organized around a single confession. Education reached broader segments of society, although progress remained uneven. Literacy rates rose gradually, particularly in urban areas and among groups connected to commerce, administration, and the churches. Reading moved increasingly from communal recitation toward private engagement. Diaries, household books, and personal correspondence revealed a strengthened sense of individual perspective. People recorded expenses, described family events, preserved memories, and reflected upon their own experiences with an intimacy that earlier records had less often expressed. Family life nevertheless maintained many traditional structures while adapting to economic change. Urban households frequently combined living and working spaces. Apprenticeship remained a principal path to skilled employment, linking young people to masters, workshops, and commercial networks. Rural communities continued to follow agricultural routines, shaped by seasonal rhythms, even as markets and state demands altered production. The Renaissance, therefore, reached beyond courts and academies. Its influence appeared in the ways people organized labor, managed property, recorded relationships, and understood their responsibilities within a community. The emphasis on civic participation also influenced later political thought. Writers examined the balance between monarchy, aristocracy, and representative institutions. Discussions of rights, law, and governance drew indirectly upon classical precedents revived by Renaissance scholars. Ancient political texts did not provide ready-made answers, but they supplied concepts and examples with which European thinkers could debate the limits of power. The language of citizenship, virtue, liberty, and public responsibility remained available for later arguments about reform. The artistic heritage of the Renaissance became a benchmark for excellence. Later generations studied Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael as models of mastery, even when their own artistic goals differed. Their works were preserved and displayed as exemplars rather than treated merely as contemporary experiments. The period's architectural achievements endured physically as well. Domes, courtyards, churches, and palaces continued to define urban skylines. These buildings outlived their original patrons and acquired new functions as governments, institutions, and societies changed. Economic transformation accelerated into the 18th century. Commercial capitalism expanded, banking houses operated across borders, and insurance systems and stock exchanges helped manage financial risk. The Renaissance had prepared Europe for this complexity by encouraging calculation, contracts, and documentation. Double-entry bookkeeping, refined in Italian merchant houses, became a widely adopted practice. Accounting skills were taught systematically because large enterprises required dependable methods for tracking assets, debts, and transactions. Scientific progress likewise built upon Renaissance observation. When Isaac Newton published the Principia in 1687, he synthesized earlier discoveries into mathematical laws of motion and gravity. Newton belonged to a later generation, yet his achievement depended upon methods cultivated by Renaissance scholars: close observation, mathematical description, comparison of evidence, and criticism of inherited assumptions. Philosophers increasingly distinguished natural philosophy from theology, even when they retained personal religious belief. Inquiry into human society and governance developed alongside the study of nature. The arts diversified as well. Opera emerged in Italy around the turn of the 17th century, combining music, theater, poetry, and classical themes. It reflected the Renaissance fascination with antiquity while creating new forms of performance. Gardens designed with geometric precision expressed ideals of order and symmetry inherited from Renaissance planning. Later landscape traditions modified those principles, but the classical desire to shape space according to reason remained visible. Historical consciousness deepened during these centuries. Scholars began writing comprehensive history of nations and regions, while archives preserved official documents with increasing regularity. A sense of temporal progression, antiquity, the medieval period, the Renaissance, and the modern age became embedded in European thought. By the 18th century, Enlightenment writers explicitly credited earlier generations with reopening paths of inquiry. They built upon Renaissance philology, science, and political analysis while pursuing broader reform. The Renaissance thus functioned as a bridge between medieval inheritance and modern structure. It did not abolish faith, monarchy, or tradition. Instead, it recalibrated their relationship with knowledge, art, and public life. In households across Europe, printed books rested on shelves, calendars standardized timekeeping, maps depicted distant continents, and contracts governed trade. These were quiet signs of lasting change. The era that had begun with renewed attention to ancient texts concluded by embedding systematic inquiry into European habits of reading, measuring, recording, and debating. Its greatest achievement was not perfection, but the creation of tools with which later generations could confront an uncertain world. Among the Renaissance's most durable effects was a new relationship to knowledge. Medieval scholars often approached authoritative works through layers of established commentary, whereas humanists sought the earliest and most reliable versions available. They compared manuscripts, identified errors, restored damaged passages, and considered the historical circumstances in which texts have been written. Methods first applied to Greek and Roman literature soon influenced biblical studies, law, history, and natural philosophy. Tradition retained considerable authority, but inherited claims became increasingly open to correction. This critical approach encouraged confidence in cumulative learning. Humanists believed that close study of antiquity could improve contemporary language, ethics, education, and government. Natural philosophers gradually extended the same confidence to observations that contradicted accepted models. Knowledge was no longer understood solely as a fixed inheritance to be preserved. It could also be revised through evidence, discussion, and repeated investigation. Such ideas developed unevenly, and scholars still worked within religious and classical frameworks, but the conviction that understanding could advance became increasingly influential. Art revealed a similar trust in disciplined observation. Linear perspective offered painters a mathematical method for organizing space, while anatomical investigation provided more convincing representations of the body. Architects examined proportional relationships, and sculptors studied posture, movement, and the effects of light upon physical form. These practices amounted to more than improvements in craftsmanship. They reflected the belief that nature possessed patterns that careful observers could discover. Even when Baroque artists later rejected Renaissance restraint, they continued to rely upon technical knowledge developed during these centuries. Government changed as well. The independent cities of Italy had provided fertile ground for humanist scholarship, public patronage, and experiments in civic administration. Over time, larger monarchies incorporated many of their methods. Permanent ambassadors replaced some temporary diplomatic missions, officials maintained increasingly detailed archives, and rulers depended upon educated secretaries trained in rhetoric and law. Custom remained important, but written statutes, treaties, tax records, and judicial procedures gave political institutions greater continuity. Administration became a specialized activity supported by expanding bodies of documentation. Economic developments connected these institutions to wider systems of exchange. Oceanic voyages opened routes for commodities, people, and information, while financial techniques developed by Italian merchants spread throughout Europe. Bills of exchange, double-entry bookkeeping, insurance arrangements, and partnerships allowed commerce to operate across great distances. These innovations strengthened commercial capitalism, although prosperity was distributed unequally. Overseas expansion also produced conquest, forced labor, enslavement, and ecological disruption. Curiosity and ambition could not be separated from the violence through which European influence grew. Religious conflict likewise carried the imprint of Renaissance scholarship. Reformers compared translations with biblical texts in Hebrew and Greek, challenged traditional interpretations, and used inexpensive publications to reach broad audiences. Catholic scholars and institutions responded with their own educational programs, textual research, preaching, and artistic commissions. Confessional division transformed European politics and worship, yet opposing sides frequently employed similar intellectual tools. Philology, translation, persuasive writing, and print became essential weapons in struggles over belief and ecclesiastical authority. Education broadened in response to these demands. Grammar schools trained future clergy, merchants, diplomats, lawyers, and civil servants in languages and rhetoric. Universities retained older disciplines while giving greater attention to mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and natural philosophy. Students crossed political borders to attend respected institutions, carrying books and arguments with them. Growing bureaucracies, commercial enterprises, and religious organizations all required people capable of interpreting documents and producing clear, written records. Learning thus became connected not only with contemplation, but also with professional advancement. Urban life provided additional settings for exchange. Monuments and government buildings expressed collective memory, while streets and marketplaces brought together residents, travelers, craftsmen, and traders. During the following centuries, periodicals, coffeehouses, academies, and salons created further opportunities to discuss politics, literature, science, and news. Readers learned about wars, discoveries, prices, and controversies far beyond their immediate communities. A wider public culture emerged gradually, limited by wealth, gender, and education, but nevertheless capable of connecting local experience with events elsewhere. The period also changed how individuals represented themselves. Painters and writers asserted authorship more openly, and patrons used portraits, chapels, tombs, and inscriptions to preserve their reputations. Diaries, memoirs, letters, and autobiographical works gave personal experience a more prominent place in historical memory. This did not produce modern individualism all at once. Family obligations, corporate membership, religion, and social rank still shaped identity. Most Europeans continued to live within inherited hierarchies, and agricultural routines changed much more slowly than courtly or urban fashions. For that reason, the Renaissance is best understood as a redirection rather than a clean rupture. Devotional life remained fundamental. Classical learning coexisted with Christian commitments, and innovations developed beside deeply rooted customs. Its importance lay in the institutions that preserved new practices. Schools trained readers, presses reproduced arguments, archives accumulated records, and administrative offices converted knowledge into routine procedure. What began in particular courts, cities, workshops, and libraries eventually acquired a durability that outlasted the circumstances of its creation. Later generations inherited both the achievements and contradictions of this transformation. Machiavelli's unsentimental examination of political power contributed to modern discussions of statecraft. Artistic perspective and anatomical study remained central to academic training. Textual criticism helped prepare the way for historical scholarship, while measurement, experimentation, and publication supported the scientific revolution. Exploration increased geographical understanding, even as colonial domination inflicted profound suffering across the world. The Renaissance offered no single path toward improvement, but it established methods for investigating difficult questions. Its deepest legacy, therefore, resides less in famous buildings or paintings than in recurring intellectual practices. To compare sources, question errors, observe nature, preserve evidence, and communicate conclusions became defining expectations of educated inquiry. Revolutions, industrialization, and modern ideologies arose under very different conditions, yet their participants used institutions and habits developed over the preceding centuries. The name Renaissance was applied retrospectively, but it describes a genuine transformation. Europeans came to regard the past as something to recover critically, the present as something to analyze, and the future as something human effort might alter. These practical developments reflected deeper changes in organization and thought. The Renaissance also altered how Europeans understood themselves within history. By distinguishing between antiquity, the medieval period, and their own time, scholars introduced a layered sense of chronology. This awareness of historical distance encouraged comparison and critique. Religious transformation during the era reshaped communities permanently. Confessional identities became embedded in political structures, while scholarship and education continued across religious divides, often sharing methods even when reaching different conclusions. As the early modern period matured into the Enlightenment, many thinkers credited earlier centuries with reopening intellectual possibilities. Philosophers such as Voltaire and Montesquieu studied classical history through Renaissance editions. Scientists built upon observations gathered by 16th and 17th century investigators, while political theorists examined ancient republics through humanist translations. The Renaissance thus appears less as a sudden awakening than as a sustained recalibration. It encouraged Europeans to examine inherited knowledge, measure nature carefully, cultivate artistic skill, and record governance systematically. Its legacy continued shaping modern institutions. Universities preserved curricular traditions rooted in humanist education. Scientific academies reflected collaborative practices established during the 17th century. Museums preserved artworks commissioned by Renaissance patrons, while legal systems retained Roman foundations, rediscovered and refined during the period. Even the concept of rebirth revealed a shift in historical imagination. It suggested that societies could renew themselves by engaging critically with their past. The idea of learning from earlier civilizations while adapting their lessons to present needs remains influential. The Renaissance was not confined to Florence or Rome, nor was it limited to a handful of celebrated names. It was a gradual transformation involving merchants who kept careful accounts, printers who set type by hand, students who memorized Latin verses, sailors who charted new routes, and artisans who experimented with light, proportion, and stone. Together, their activities reshaped Europe's relationship to knowledge, art, governance, and the wider world. The movement bridged medieval inheritance and modern ambition, unfolding through patient study and practical adaptation rather than sudden upheaval. Its influence remains visible in books, buildings, educational institutions, and the expectation that ideas should be examined and tested. The movement that began with scholars searching dusty libraries ultimately embedded inquiry within everyday cultural and administrative life. The Renaissance, therefore, stands as a historical transformation in which recovered knowledge, institutional change, and practical experimentation altered Europe's understanding of its past and expanded its capacity to shape the future.